Hi, I'm Barbara.
I'm Cheryl.
And I'm Naima. We're three Black moms.
Happy New Year, everyone. It is great to be here and talk about some great stories and interest and deliver information about all kinds of subjects. Well, today we're going to be talking to a very special guest that I have known for many years. Michelle Hughes has established her own law firm. She is a lawyer who specializes in transracial adoptions. Now, she established her own law firm in 1993, and her legal practice focuses primarily on family building and especially adoption. She also is currently one of the appointed Cook County Adoption Court Guardians and Litims. Ms. Hughes is a fellow of the Academy of Adoption and Assisted Reproduction Attorneys, AAAA, a member of the Chicago Bar Association Adoption Committee, and a former vice chair of Cook County Bar Association Adoption Committee and current member of Adoption Registry Confidential Intermediary Advisory Council. Michelle is also the former chair of the CI, Confidential Intermediate Advisory Committee with the Department of Children and Family Services. Ms. Hughes started organizing and conducting seminars on transracial adoptions in 1991. In 1994, she co-founded Bridge Communications and Company, specializing in diversity training with an emphasis on transracial adoption education. She has discussed multiracial issues, including transracial adoption, in many forums, including appearing on several TV broadcasts and on the radio. Bridge Communications training was featured in the film Outside Looking In, Transracial Adoption in America. Ms. Hughes has founded several adoption-related Facebook groups and administers even more. She regularly has spoken at adoption conferences, adoption agencies, and adoption camps for more than 2 decades. Now, I met Michelle many years ago when my children were small at a biracial family network event. And I interviewed Michelle over a couple of articles about interracial marriage, transracial adoption for Cornerstone Magazine, and some of them were actually published. Now, one of the questions that comes up a lot of times has been how to help people, how to train people to deal with transracial adoptions. And I remember in one of the interviews that I did with Michelle, she talked about dealing with personal racial prejudices that people may have. And they even had like a forum where there were a list of words that come to mind when a person thinks of a certain racial or ethnicity. And just to get those things out, the kind of stereotypes that maybe you believed or were raised believing, and the things that were not true, to dispel certain myths and ideas. And this helped in dealing with parents who are wanting to adopt a child who may be ethnically or racially or culturally different than they are. So we're going to talk about all those things and discuss, is it okay? Do children thrive when they are being raised by parents who are a different race or ethnicity than they are? And is it good for white parents to adopt Black children?
Yes.
I'm interested, before we bring Michelle on, I'm very interested in this subject. I have a biracial child. My husband is white. My daughter is biracial. She identifies as biracial Black. And I am a professor of journalism where I teach reporting issues of diversity. And one of the things that we do, and there are many tests. Harvard had developed a few years ago the implicit bias test. And I have these tests, and we take these tests throughout the semester. It may be Black and white, it may be race and weapons, Asian, Muslim, Jew, disability. So there are all kinds of implicit bias that people come in. And I've also had students, usually Asian students, who were adopted by white parents. And I also used to have a good friend who was adopted. She was South Korean, and she was adopted by white parents. And I remember when we were in our 20s, and she talked about how hard it was because, there weren't any other Asians in her community. So she was coming into an all white community, and she faced a lot of prejudice from a lot of the community members, especially when she got to dating age and mothers didn't want their sons to date her because she was half Korean. I've also heard of other children who've had issues because they feel as if they are being forced to assimilate into a culture that isn't theirs. And it's been painful. And I also see a lot of things on Instagram and some of the other things where biracial or Black children talk about the prejudice that they learn. And Colin Kaepernick was another one who talked about it a lot in his story about them not being racially
Sensitive.
sensitive enough to understand that he wasn't just a chocolate covered white child. And we don't really address race in this country from the liberal side the way we should, because people get very uncomfortable and then they start talking about, well, I'm not racist. Yes, but you benefit from the system, and a lot of your attitudes are still racist, even though you don't realize or acknowledge them. So I'm interested in what Michelle has to say, especially about the diversity training. And I'm wondering, is that always enough? And should we really be more discerning? I've also heard that a lot of times it's harder for Black families to adopt, and that they are given more hoops to jump through to adopt Black children. And I don't want to say that Black children should always be with Black parents, because I think being in a family is more important than being raised in the foster care system. But it's tough. It's tough when you're talking in a very racist society, which America is, about bringing a Black child into a white household.
Well, that's one of the things that a lot of people say. A lot of times when people talk about adoption, they'll say things like, well, the only thing that matters is if they're loved. Well, yeah, that's true too. But parenting, as you know, it's more than just the love. You have to prepare them for the society. You have to give them the confidence and the self-assurance. You have to make sure that their self-esteem is intact. So the environment in which they're raised matters. And whatever you tell them about their identity, it matters. And, the fact that both of you all, of course, have raised children in a society that during the time we were growing up, and even now, there's still some intense racial tensions. And your children have lived through a lot of times when, this nation was hostile toward Black people. And you never know what's going to happen outside your home. So you have to prepare them so they can mentally handle any kind of hostility, even bias toward them by teachers. You have to be able to teach them to stand up for themselves. And I don't know if a white parent without the other Black parent could do that if they had a child, if both parents are white and the child is feeling like the teacher is biased against them. And, it's easy to dismiss. Oh, yeah, no, you're just imagining that, just do your work. I mean, it's easy to be dismissive because you're not used to having a child where the teacher really is biased against them or doesn't like them or treats them differently, because that might not have been your experience. So how do you prepare a child for an attitude from another adult? Is one thing you deal with bullying from their peers, but what about
which is bad enough because
bad enough?
They're hearing the N word from their peers, but it had to come from somewhere.
Right.
And the teacher or the administration doesn't address it, and they go home and they don't feel like they can even address it with you.
Because they know
that's a lot. And I find that even if the parent is the parent, a lot of times white people are uncomfortable with talking about race and racism, and it's easy to be dismissive and not want to acknowledge that these things are happening. Sarah had totally different experiences when she and I were together when she was little than when she was with her father. Now, she looks just like him, but she always had the feeling that people would assume she was adopted because she was obviously not fully white. And he did not see it. And it hurt her in a lot of ways. And we're still dealing with that. And he's still uncomfortable in a lot of ways talking about these things because he sees the love of his life. He sees his daughter, but he doesn't see what the world is seeing and judging when they look at them together. And now that she's a very beautiful young woman and she's with him, and she makes a big deal when it's just the two of them to say dad, so that people don't think this is her sugar daddy and why is this older man with this young woman. So
and it's kind of sad that you have to be aware of those kinds of things.
She has to be aware of that because of the racial disparity. And so she has to make sure that people know this is my father. And I'm wondering how that happens when you are coming, and this is his biological daughter, but how do you deal with that when you're coming into a place where strangers feel the audacity to ask about, are you all adopted, or are you, or is this, those kind of things, where did they come from? And of course, transracial adoption can also happen where they're coming from a different country. And that is a whole other kettle of fish. So
absolutely. And that's the thing also. It's one thing when they're another race, but when they're from another country, then you're talking about a whole different culture that you might not know anything about. And sometimes people, they think, oh, well, the poor African children, where are we going to give them a good home? And all that's admirable.
Same thing with the Haitians.
Yes.
But the thing is that we have to get rid of, if you come in with that white savior complex,
that's not good.
That's not good, because you feel like that child should be grateful. This is not a pet. This is a person.
Ooh.
So you're not, the whole white savior thing with the people with their vacations where they're helping the poor African children and they just love them so much and they just take lots of pictures with them on Instagram without anybody's permission, because you don't do that to children who are not your own. And so we have to get through a lot if you're talking cultural too.
So I don't know. So Barbara, did you have any experiences where your children with Eric by himself, your husband, was different than your children with you? I mean, did you ever experience people assuming different things when they were with you, or assuming different things when they were with him, as opposed to when you were all together?
I'm
family?
trying to remember if I did. I know I got a lot of rudeness when the children were really young, when they were like under the age of 5 or something like that. Um, my experience in Chicago, because we lived in uptown in a very racially diverse area where there were a lot of mixed parents and children that were biracial, I think it was a little more accepting in that place. And you only ran into the rudeness when you got out of that space. For myself, I found it pretty admirable that I was able to become a part of different biracial family type groups to kind of give that support that you needed, going to events where there were other children that looked like them, other families that looked like us. And I think with Eric, he was a little oblivious to that kind of thing. I know when I interviewed some people from one of the churches who a woman had adopted, she and her husband had adopted 4 Black children to keep them all together. And she said that her problem was that other people judged her for adopting Black children. It was like, why can't you have your own? And I don't know if she could or couldn't, but she said that she learned a lot about racism. She actually went through a lot of the pain that they went through when she discovered how her children were being treated at school. And she said at first she thought, oh, it must be just me. But her children would tell her things, and she started to be sensitized to the place where she could pick up on those instances where her children were being discriminated against. And she really went to bat for them in a lot of different situations. So I think part of being in a place where you can make the kind of decisions to help train your kids and stand up for your kids and be in a place where they can grow up and be themselves and be with other kids, those are opportunities that I always looked for. I always looked for some kind of mixed race avenue where they would be able to be like everyone else or other people that look like me. And I think that was really helpful for them.
Yeah, I think that's the whole thing, is having your children be in an environment where people look like them. That's one of the challenges, I think, when it comes to transracial adoption. If you are in an all white community and you bring this Black child in and you don't know any Black people and you don't take them where any Black people are, and they have no sense of someone looking like them, then that's going to be very isolating. And I think it would be easy for parents to just pretend like, well, everything's fine. Oh, just blend in or whatever they think can happen. Oh, children will be children. Maybe not take it as seriously when they're bullied, like children do bully others, or if adults say something, or not being sensitive if you let your child go to someone's house and something awful happens or something is said. I used to, well, every now and then I have a friend who teaches a college class, and he brings in these students from other states, usually like Utah or Colorado, where there are not very few Black people. But these students are taking an urban media class so they can kind of understand some of the issues dealing in an urban environment. And one of the first things, whenever I come in and I address the class, one of the first things I ask them is, when did they first become aware of racism? And they always had some story about how maybe they brought a Black friend home and their parents freaked out and, scolded them or whatever, or a neighbor said something, or something happened in school. It was always some kind of thing where an adult burst their bubble, where even if they, as a child, they were innocent and had this black friend, some adult would say something awful, or maybe some older children pick on them or something, where suddenly, you know, things were not normal, and you don't know how to handle it because, you know, no one talks about racism when there's only one race. So I think that's one of the things that I would see would happen in those kind of environments. And then for the every now and then, you know, be maybe a couple of black students in the class, and they would always, same thing. It would always be a situation where, in their childhood innocence, they would think everything is fine, and then some adult person would say something hurtful, or they'd be bullied, and no one would come to their rescue. So if you have a child and you don't have any other people in that environment that they can feel connected to, I think one of the things you got to do is make it a point to take them to some black things, or make some black friends, or do something so that you can become more sensitive. Because I think it's easy when a person isn't going through that to not be aware of how children are experiencing life, and how children are easily hurt, and how adults will be hurtful. And if you've never experienced discrimination from another adult, you might think your child is either making things up, or imagining things, or too sensitive, or you don't know how to handle it. So you might just say things like, oh, well, you know, just ignore it, or whatever. And they can't, because it's their life.
Can we bring Michelle on?
Yeah, well, we will bring her on after the break.
Oh, is she still trying to get good lighting?
Yes. So we're working
Well,
on
you know, we could talk in the dark and then have it be bright, because I know she has a lot to say.
Yes. Well, we would like to not have, you know, people might think we're trying to say something. We have her all dark.
Protection.
Protect her identity. I remember because Michelle met with Lavinia and got a chance to talk. This is right before Lavinia went off to college, and she was giving her some tips, especially relating to some of the things that she actually might run into in her as a biracial woman coming to a place where it was majority white students. And I remember in one of my interviews with Michelle, I asked her how she felt about people asking, well, what are you? And I remember Michelle saying, you know, at first it did not offend me. But then as time went on, I started to question, well, why are you asking me what I am? Because, you know, sometimes a racially mixed person is a little bit ambiguous. People usually think you're either like them, you're either, you know, Puerto Rican or Mexican or Italian, you know, or Arabian or something. And she said that part of the reason that being asked, what are you, can be offensive is because there is a sense that the person is trying to put you in a certain box. Like if I say I'm a certain way, does this mean you're going to treat me differently? Are you going to like me less? Are you going to, because of a stereotypical bias that you already have, are you going to try to fit me into that bias? Because a lot of times when you are in a situation where people are trying to relate to you, they unmistakably will accidentally, maybe not even realize they're being offensive by trying to relate to you, by trying to figure out what you are. Why can't you just be a person first and then all the other stuff follows later? So sometimes that can be a problem.
Yes, it can.
It's interesting because we talk about that, especially in a lot of Asians also experience it. It says, well, where are you really from?
Yes.
There's even a little comedy routine.
Oh yes, I've shown it in class. And
Yeah.
my student, and I don't want to expose him, so I won't say what his name is, but my student is my newest student is an Asian man, and he talked about in the first class where we talked about culture and white people's culture, and he said, and he actually addressed the idea that Asians have to assimilate by changing their names. And he does not change his name. And every single, except for one, every single Asian student I have has had a European name. And they, and they pick those names, and they're told, if they're international students, they're told, well, you need like a European name so you can properly assimilate. Well, I'm sorry, you know what? I will call you what you want to be called, but they all want to be called, Mandy or Zoe or Jennifer or whatever the name is, or, and they all
Because Americans are too lazy to learn
Right.
how to pronounce the
And
person's
they're
name.
lazy and
you
they're
should
racist.
marry them.
And they're racist. That's a form of
Yeah.
microaggression.
Right.
You're not important enough for me to figure out how to pronounce your name. And so they are told that is what they have to do. And it was frustrating, and it was so refreshing for my first students who say this. And I said, oh, I'm going to enjoy having you in this class, because it was nice, because everyone else, except for one, I had one student last year who used her name, and I was happy to figure out. I said, you know what? Tell me how to say it. I will keep on saying it until I get it right. I'll figure it out. And if I say it wrong, correct me. But it's this whole thing of assimilation, because my student says, you hear a lot of Kevins, but you're never going to hear Deshaun, which also shows you that they also are looking for white sounding names, not black sounding names, not DeMarcus, not Jamal. They're looking for a Kevin or a Joe or whatever. Uh, so it's interesting that he said that, and I says, oh, the first in all these years, it's the first time that somebody's actually addressed that. It was brought up in class last year where they said, well, we were told that this is what we should do. So they, instead of whatever her name was, she goes by Grace, or, and it's just ridiculous. And so, and that's part of the othering that we do with any non global majority person, because we're all people of color are part of the global majority. We're not minorities. That we are told that we have to assimilate. We have to, well, if the teacher
Right.
is saying that, just ignore them or whatever. And we do our children a disservice. We do all our children a disservice by telling them, you have to be something that you're not.
Yes. And that's one of the things that has to change. We adjusting to other people's racism. And I think people have to be very strong in that. And I don't know if a white family could be strong enough to stand up to that sort of thing, because sometimes black families aren't strong enough. So you're talking about Asians that are coming into a culture that could be hostile and pressuring them to conform to some idea of what is normal.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think anytime.
And so much of it depends on where you live. I remember a
Right.
young woman who was a friend of mine. Her name was Z. She spelled it Xi. She was Hmong.
Yeah.
And she talked about how, as a young person growing up in an all-white suburb, white parents, and that she thought she was white, and then she went through an identity crisis of finding herself. It was like a journey that she was going on. And she said, her friend said, oh, Z, we know, we love you, we know who you are, but in her mind and the way she was raised, she thought she was white for a long time before she actually did some historical work about her own people, her natural culture, which is what it would have been. And she just talks about how it was an eye-opening experience. And I had another friend who was a biracial. She and her brother had been adopted by a white family. And she said, like the other Anglo relatives, were always oblivious to the fact that she was biracial, because they'd make these comments about, Black people in general that were negative, and they would say, "Oh, but we don't mean you." You know, they
We
quickly
don't mean
you
you,
know,
as if it makes it okay.
and
Yeah,
but
right.
it's just living in kind of an age of ignorance where people are so insensitive that they don't really invest in what is required to understand how you're raising a child who may not be your ethnicity, may not be your racial group, may not have your natural culture, and
Even
you know, in your love for the child, of course, you're going to raise them the best you can as a parent.
Yeah, that's all you can
may
do.
not be
That's all you can.
aware of the other things that they are having to deal with.
Right. Well, we're going to take a break.
yes,
We're going to take a quick break and come back with Attorney Michelle M. Hughes, who is a transracial adoption attorney and has faced a lot of these issues. And we'll find out, if you're going to do this, what really should you do to prepare yourself? So we'll be right back. And if you'd like to make some comments, feel free to write in your comments on our Facebook page. If you're joining us on YouTube, make sure you write in your comments on YouTube. We'll bring them up on the screen and share your thoughts. Do you think white parents should adopt Black children? And if so, what do they need to know before they do it? Well, we'll be right back after this quick break. So stay with us.
Hi, I'm Naima Latif, and if you're watching this, that means you're one of the 4.6 billion people from around the world who are using an electronic device to talk to people. In these times, people are using the internet to talk to everybody. Friends, neighbors, family members, co-workers. People are on their cell phones and computers all day long. Now, if you're in business, that is great news. That means you can sell your products and services all day long and never have to leave your home. All you need is a media connection, somebody to connect you to an audience. And that's why I'm talking to you today. We produce programs, and our audience members are people who shop. They buy clothes, food, beauty supplies, cleaning supplies, home repair, transportation services, child care services. Whatever you're selling, they need to buy it. We're your media connection. Just follow this link, and tomorrow you can sit back and relax at home while your business is making you money.
All right, we are back, and joining us is Michelle Hughes. All right.
Should we get over light?
Okay, so let there be light. Yes, Michelle, thank you so much.
Yay, that's perfect.
The technical problems of 2025.
yes.
Yes. Well, we're glad you're on, and you know, we really would like to see more adoptions, but we also realize that there are some issues that parents need to address. So, given your experience, what are some things that parents need to know if they are going to adopt a child? If their white parents are going to adopt a child who is Black, will be specific to that particular situation. What would you say?
So I think that all adoptive parents really need more adoption education in general. We are in 2025, and I think it's imperative that we get this adoption education that parents in the past did not get. I think that we have problems with doing transracial adoption education. So let me just back up, because people lump adoption all the same type of adoption, right? So there is both domestic infant adoption, there is foster care adoption, and there is international adoption. I don't usually talk about international adoption anymore because international adoption is it's basically tanking. There's not a whole lot of it happening, and so it's just not on my radar anymore. There also is technically family adoption, step parent, grandparent, stuff like that, which sometimes transracial adoption does apply to that too. but mostly we'll be talking about foster care adoption and domestic infant adoption. So they operate entirely differently. They're two different systems. And when you talk about foster care adoption, one of the problems is that we have some federal law, the Multi-Ethnic Placement Act, and the Interethnic Placement Act, which actually gives the punishments if you violate the Multi-Ethnic Placement Acts. And to simplify it, it basically says we are not going to consider race when we're talking about adoption. It comes out of a whole history of a case where a Black child was with a white family for about 5-6 years. And then all of a sudden, the child was available for adoption. And they managed to go find Black family for the child, and then the white family sued, and then we got this legislation. And so now what happens is, in a lot of places across the country, they won't even talk about race. They won't talk about hair care. They won't talk about skin care. They won't talk about discrimination, racism, how to talk to anybody in the Black community. It's like this void because they're afraid that they will get punished, which basically, I think there was a case in Ohio where they punished the agency millions of dollars. And so there's like this we're going to pretend that race isn't an issue that happens in a lot of foster care adoptions. With domestic infant adoptions, it's motivated differently. And one of the things that's changed radically since what most people know about adoption is that the birth moms are making choices with regards to who should parent their child. So basically what happens if you have a birth mom, she's actually only an expectant mom at that point, but if you have an expectant mom who's thinking about adoption, and it varies how it operates, but basically she'll call an agency and say, hey, I'm thinking about adoption. They'll come out, talk to her, do some social work, and then they will show her profiles that they have in their agency. Issue number one is some of these agencies don't have a single Black family in the profile. But if they do, or if they don't, they still show the profiles. And then the expected mom picks the family. So now you have a Black mom who is picking the family, and it's not really left up to the system, except that the system is sort of biased because adoption now is running roughly between an inexpensive agency would be $30,000. There are some people who say $60,000 is the average for adoption now. And we know that there's a disparity in income and wealth between Black families and white families. So what happens is that a lot of these agencies, there are no Black families. The second thing that happens is because of systematic racism, I'm oversimplifying, but systematic racism, often the Black expected moms have less safety nets than a lot of the white expected moms. So therefore they need more assistance than the white expected moms. So they need more rent, more food money, more what we call birth mother expenses, which means they tend to be a much more expensive adoption, which loops right back to how we have a disparity of income and wealth in this society, which therefore then leans towards white parents being able to cover their expenses. And almost any expectant mom who's making this decision is more or less in crisis situation and making really hard decisions at a very difficult time in her life without a lot of support systems. And so if she can get her rent paid, she is more likely to go with the family that she can get her rent paid than she is to think about that long-term situation of where her kid will be raised and will somebody understand her. In fact, she is often not even thinking about the difference between the white family who is willing to learn or has already learned and the white family who is unwilling to learn anything about the Black community. So you have this problem where money gets in the way and expected moms are not educated enough to know, like, what will this mean for my child down the road? And it's a totally different system than the foster care system, where kids often end up in a home. First of all, they're usually not babies, they're usually older, and they often end up in a home where the bed was available that night, right? Because in the foster care system, kids are removed from their biological parents, and they're often removed in emergency situations. So it's not like, hey, we're going to think about this for 3 months and then the kid will be removed. It's a situation where a social worker came out, decided for whatever reason that this is an unsafe place for this child and this child has to be removed right now. And so now you have now you have a toddler, or maybe you have 3 kids. You have a 3, 6, and 8-year-old, and you got to find a foster family that night for that kid to go to, or those kids to go to. And you only have so many people that are licensed. You only have so many people that have 3 beds available. You only have so many people that are actually, you can get on the phone right then and are willing to take those kids. And so often what happens in foster care is that kids end up in homes that are just available at the moment, right? And people fall in love with kids. So then the kid is there while the birth mom, or mom at that point, is trying to work her plan, which she may or may not be successful. In foster care, she obviously is unsuccessful, usually, if it ever makes it to adoption. And so now the kid's been there for a year and a half, and it may have not been the best match racially. It may have not even been the best match for a variety of other reasons, health reasons, mental health reasons, therapy that's available. I mean, if you have a situation where a kid needs therapy every week and they're in the middle of a rural area where there's no therapist, that's not a good match, even though the parents may be wonderful and loving. And so what happens is the kids often in foster care, the parents don't have the skill set or the match. But now that's a year and a half later, the kid's been there for a year and a half. They love this kid, and nobody wants to remove the kid because you have a bonding issue. So now you're debating the bonding versus the racial aspect. And then I would add, there's a lot of other aspects that you have to evaluate in the situation. But they're not, the only way we can deal with it on the front end is everybody gets education. And because of MIPA and IEPA, nobody wants to educate, right? They're so scared to talk about it. And so they end up giving education on how to parent the sexually abused child, how to parent the child with PTSD, how to parent the child who was substance exposed, but they never want to talk about race. Then you get the flip side in private agencies where they want to talk about how to parent an adoptive child. But most of those agencies have nobody of color working for them. I once asked at a conference of adoption attorneys across the nation, of the hundreds of adoption agencies, there were, as far as we could figure out, only 3 agencies who had Black executive directors. Right? And so what you also have is people who don't think it's an issue making the decisions. And it's also affecting sometimes their bottom line. Sometimes it's not, because it depends upon the agency. And if they are for profit, not for profit, do they operate like for profit, not for profit? But there's a lot of other issues that get in the way of how kids get placed. And I would love to see Black expectant moms better educated on picking families. I would love to see all expectant moms better educated on how to pick families, frankly.
Well, you know,
what kind of training have you done in the past before the feelings of we're not going to talk about race, before that came up? What kind of training did you give prospective parents?
So I used to have a company that did 9 hours of training that we were actually approved by the Illinois Department of Children and Family Services. But the only people who came through our trainings were from private agencies that didn't have to deal with MIPA and IEPA. And so it was always people who were adopting newborn babies. We also did a teletraining that was 4.5 hours because we had people that were unable to show up for the training in person. And this was when I was doing teletraining, it was really, I did do some Zoom, but it was really before the Zoom really just exploded.
Pre-COVID.
Yes, it was pre-COVID. But I always preferred the in-person because you could read all the body language. But I have to say, one of the things that happened with the teleclasses and people not showing their faces as they asked questions was the fact that they would ask questions that they would never ask in person. And so you really ended up finding out some of the um,
Biases.
the biases and also how uninformed some people were, right? Because they weren't scared to ask the question because they weren't in a classroom with other people where people were watching their body languages and their faces, and so you really got a touch of what's going on out there. So we did a class, and our class was basically set up because I had transracial adoptee partners at one particular point. And so we did a class that basically was set up first to talk about race, what it was interpreted as, stereotypes. And we did, everything was interactive. So we went through all these different exercises, right? And that was basically class 1 and 2. And then the third class, I would always get a panel of transracial adoptees who would speak about their experiences. And so they could talk from the adoptee perspective on how this all interacted. So for example, I will always remember I did this one panel and it just happened to be, I don't know, it was like 2 weeks before Thanksgiving, right? And so holidays was an issue that wouldn't normally come up, in a July class, but in a November class where everybody was about to go home to their parents, it was fascinating because on the panel I had one Black adoptee, one Asian adoptee, and one Hispanic adoptee on that particular class. And all three of them, you could hear the sigh in their voice as they were like, "Ugh, I gotta go home." And one adoptee talked about how her and her husband literally had to stay at her sibling's house because her parents wouldn't let her husband in the house because he was Black. It was just this realization that these parents had raised these children to adults and really had never addressed the racial issue, and also had racial hierarchies themselves, because I believe it was the Hispanic panelist who was actually married to a Black man. So her parents were okay with the Hispanic transracial adoption, but they weren't okay with a Black man in their home. And that was not the first time I had heard things like that. So not only do you deal with just the racial differences, you also deal with the anti-Blackness. And often back in the day before the internet was everywhere and people would just call me on the phone as a lawyer, I can tell you people would often tell me straight out, I'll take anything but Black.
Ooh.
Right? Because I wasn't all over the internet. You could find me easily now. And if you researched a little, you probably wouldn't call me and say that, right? But back in the day,
isn't it? Isn't it good to know that? It's like putting your picture on your resume. So if they don't want you, you're not
up front.
wasting your time because they,
well, I don't have to hear it. But here's the thing. Now be a biracial adoptee or just biracial, right? And you happen to be the biracial person who's blonde and blue-eyed. So everybody assumes that you're not Black, right? But you embrace your Black identity, and so now you have to deal with all these people saying stuff in front of you. So yes, I think it's helpful for me that I don't have to listen to it anymore, but I'm not sure that it's always helpful or easy for every transracial adoptee, right? And so you have these adoptees who, I had parents all the time who would also say, I'll take biracial, but not Black, assuming that their biracial kid would somehow not look Black.
Right. That's what they're assuming.
Right. So, and I can tell you, because I keep in touch with many of my clients and I'm Facebook friends with some of them. Some of those biracial kids, they very much would never be identified as anything else but Black. So then they end up raising Black identifying children, or whether the kids identify as Black or not, or is one thing, but they present as black.
presenting,
Black
right.
presenting is what I want to say. And so now all of a sudden they're having to deal with this, which they didn't think they were going to have to deal with. Right. And are they willing to adjust? And some do a great job and some don't want to. You also see that in the transracial adoption groups on Facebook. So the other thing that's changed radically is that a lot of people get their education online. Right. And some of the education is amazing. And some of the education I take issue with. But one of the things that I have found is in any of the spaces where the education can be what they would perceive as harsh, which we wouldn't necessarily perceive as harsh. We would be like, hey, that's life. That's reality of being Black in America. And, we wouldn't think that much about it. We're just making a statement. We're trying to push them to understand. They think that they are being attacked.
Yeah.
Well, I remember several years ago, very high profile case with Judge Ann Burke, who was going to adopt the Black child that had been in their care. And people were protesting and angry and saying that the child needs to be adopted by a Black family. Well, actually, the issue was the mother was back in the picture. And I guess the mother had some difficulties, drugs or whatever the case may be. And so there was a lot of involvement in, by activists and everything else, feeling like the mother was being cast aside because she didn't have the money and power of Ann Burke. And then people were saying, yeah, but the child is what, 2 or 3 years old, whatever, doesn't even speak English or speaks Polish or whatever, because I think their housekeeper was Polish. So people were trying to say the child's not going to know their identity. They're not going to have their correct racial heritage and all those kinds of things. And, ultimately, of course, the child was adopted by the Burkes.
Actually, the child was not adopted by the Burkes. I happen to know a little bit about this case.
Yeah, I just don't know about you say it on there. But yeah.
But the child did stay with the Burkes.
Yeah.
So for me, as a professional, this case irked me in many different ways.
Yeah.
And I actually met the child because he was about 6 at the time. Beautiful young man at the time. I don't know what happened to him. I did not keep in touch. But the thing that irked me is that in most cases, that mother's rights would have been terminated. If that had been a Black family or any family actually that really didn't, have the prominence, the rights of the birth mother would have been terminated, and that wouldn't have been the fight, and the guardianship would not have happened, and the birth mother would have lost her child. But because they were the Burkes, it became a big issue,
political
and
issue.
so legally it was a different issue than the transracial adoption issue. And I think the transracial adoption issue was bigger than the Burkes case. Do I think that the Burkes were able to give that child all his identity as a Black child that would grow up to be a Black man? Probably not. But that was a separate issue from how it played out in the media. And she was smart enough to use the media to stop her rights from getting terminated.
Yeah, she did.
She did.
I think
but
there was some kind of co-parenting or something or whatever. I think that's what I heard.
The Burkes were able to keep guardianship, and then she was able to have a relationship, continue to have a relationship. And I will say that very recently, we'll say post-COVID, there has been a move towards moving more and more foster care adoptions towards guardianship. And there's a big difference between guardianship and adoption. But across the country, the courts are trying to move it more towards guardianship. Frankly, I think
between guardianship.
So adoption, the parental rights of the biological parents are terminated. And when the parents adopt the kid, it is their kid legally. Like I like to say, the buck stops with them. They make all decisions. because they are the parents. When you are a guardian, you have the day-to-day responsibilities of parenting that child, but it is not your child and the parental rights are not terminated. What it also means for the child is that the child is not the parent, is not the child of the adoptive parents. So if the adoptive parents were to die, for example, they don't inherit. If the adoptive parents were to die, they don't get Social Security. If the adoptive parents were to die, the adoptive, that family is not related to that child. Most likely the kid may go back into the system. So ultimately, you are all the other things that people don't generally think about, inheritance and stuff like that, does not come out. So when it does come out is when we have these cases. For example, we'll call the parent, we'll just call her Mary. So Mary gets the first kid and does a guardianship because they insist on a guardianship, but the second kid they let her adopt. Fast forward 15 years from now, Mary dies. Now she's treated the kids the same because she's doing the day-to-day. She loves both kids. Everything's, wonderful. But 15 years from now, she dies. The adoptive kid is her kid. The adoptive kid can get into the hospital as a child, right? Related. If the hospital wants to stop the kid who's the guardianship, because technically they're not related and the kid's now an adult. And so there's no relation. They don't, say the kids are warring as siblings, right? The one that's adopted can keep the other one out. The mother dies. Now who gets the house? The one who's adopted, not the one. The one with the guardian gets nothing. Now you can solve this by a will, but nobody's doing that to be practical. You can solve this by actually an adult adoption doesn't solve it, but they could do an adult adoption. No, very few people do it. I mean, I have had some people do it, but it doesn't solve the inheritance problem. It also plays out in immigration issues too, I might add. And we do have a lot of kids who are undocumented that end up in the system.
Wow,
So,
that's a show in itself, and we'll probably have to do that show too, given what's about to come down the pike.
Tuesday,
right.
Yeah, so we'll definitely address that. Well, Michelle, we have to have you come back because this is a whole lot that's going to happen with.
Oh my goodness, I have so many questions, and we could do a whole hour.
We could do a part 2 on this one, but definitely because there's going to be so many issues coming up with the immigrants and all of that. And
I'm scared. I have to say, I'm scared because DCFS's policy is we don't care if you're documented or undocumented with adopting. And I understand that and I get it because a lot of grandmothers are adopting their grandchildren. But I'm like, what happens if that kid comes home from school and they picked up grandma?
That's going to be an issue.
Why that kid's at school?
We will definitely have to talk about that. Well, we've got to go, but we certainly do appreciate you coming on. Now, if people want to get in touch with your law firm, what is your website or
URL?
Probably the best thing to do is to email me at hugheslaw@mindspring.com. Or you can call me at 312-857-7287. Or you can go to my website, which frankly, I don't know. I don't know the actual link. But there is only one Michelle Hughes adoption attorney. And if you Google Michelle Hughes adoption attorney, you will get me.
All right. Michelle Hughes.
I think actually, if you Google Michelle adoption attorney, you will get me.
So Michelle M. Hughes adoption attorney.
Right. But you can
And then
just
there's
go with
also
Michelle.
Bridge Communications. You're still in charge of that too, right?
In charge of what?
Bridge Communications.
I actually I had the company cease to exist. I keep a web page or a Facebook page, which I post articles now and again. But honestly, I mean, if people, like, sometimes I do lectures at law schools or to lawyers or to agencies, and I'll just come in now as a lawyer and do it. I don't have any standard classes anymore under bridge communication. Adoption has really, the numbers have decreased exponentially in the last, decade or so. And so it has not been the most, there's just not enough people, right? And the other thing is agencies often like to control the message. And so they don't like to hire outside people, because I was a little more forthcoming on racial stuff in America than what they like to tell their parents. Because remember, they want those parents as clients. Right. And as a trainer, I was wearing a totally different hat. I didn't always do the training. Sometimes other people did it. So I didn't really care, whether they were going to be a law client or whatever. They were going to get a training. I was more interested in them being prepared as best as I could in 9 hours with the children. Right. But the agencies are looking at it, we don't want this client to leave. And my attitude was, I always loved it when I had parents come through my class who said, you know what? I shouldn't be doing a transracial adoption. I am not prepared for this. That was great. In my opinion, that saved a kid. And I also love the parents who were like, oh, light bulb. I got it now. And I'm going to go get every single piece of training I can get. I am going to make an effort to reach out and do different things. I used to give them homework too, by the way. And so ultimately, those parents who really, took it as a serious thing to do because they were going to do the best for their child, I love that too.
Yes, fantastic. Well, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom, and we will definitely have you back to talk about some of these issues that are coming up as we see more families having to deal with perhaps some deportations and other things happening, and how our families are handling just the multiracial element of this society, how our children are going to adjust, and how they're going to perhaps make some changes. So thank you so much. And again, you can Google Michelle M. Hughes, adoption attorney, get all of her information, her websites and contact information, her law office, in case you're considering adoption, whether it's your own race or another race. Or
right. I do all adoptions. If it's legal, I do it. As a lawyer, I don't care if it's foster care, international, domestic, infant adoption, step parent, grandparent, kinship, or on occasion I get that parent where the next door neighbor left the kid 5 years ago. It hasn't been seen. I do that type of adoption too.
Wow.
I got stories. And secondary adoptions too.
Wow.
That's when the first adoption didn't work out, and now that parent those parents are replacing the child to another licensed social work approved family.
Wow.
Which is different than rehoming. Secondary placement is different than rehoming. I know people don't get that. That's a whole different lecture, but just letting you know.
Rehoming. That's right. Got to learn more about that. Well, we thank you all for joining us. Feel free to write in your comments on our Facebook or YouTube channel, 3 Black Moms, and join us again next week, 5 p.m. Central, 6 p.m. Eastern. And until that time, I'm Naima.
I'm Cheryl.
I'm Barbara. Thank you, Michelle, for joining us.
It was my pleasure. I'm sorry that we had so many technical problems.
Black moms. Oh, that's okay.
Hey, we made it work, and we taught a lot of people, and we're so glad that you helped to share some information so those who might be considering might go on and adopt. See you next time.
We need more adoptive and foster parents.
We need more parents. Yes, we do.
We definitely need more parents. And I suspect with Dobbs, we are going to need a lot more parents. So, I have all sorts of theories on that, but I know we're out of time.
We'll talk about it again. We'll have you back, and we want you to join us Make sure you like and subscribe our Facebook page and YouTube channel. See you next time on 3 Black Moms.
Take care.
Hi, I'm Barbara.
I'm Cheryl.
And I'm Naima. We're 3 Black Moms.